Thanks, Ruby. And thanks everyone for joining us today for the first Global Display Virtual Event 2017. We're here today with a couple of our analysts from across the world talking about anything from automotive displays to the different technologies and different applications in mobile and consumer products. And I'm going to talk about the automotive part of this for our group to start off. So getting into the information real quick, I'm going to start with details on our automotive display technology forecasts. And essentially this will be the different applications as we see it and some of the unique areas of growth and innovation that we're seeing come down the marketplace. Starting though, I want to give a quick frame of reference for established user interface technologies that we have today in today's vehicles, right? Buttons and hard keys are quite common. We know that there are a number of different ways to interact with infotainment systems in the vehicle. And it's interesting to note that while the button as a component of input is still very common in vehicles today, we think that multifunction systems will be the only ones for growth going into the future. Essentially, CAGRs on steering wheel controls and multifunction controls are the only ones with any significant growth over the time period in our forecast through 2022, but that is discrete systems with individual hard keys will soon die off. Now, if we look at touch systems, there's also an input mechanism that's very popular. It's familiar in most use cases. Customers from all walks of life are familiar with a touchscreen through different applications and devices. In the vehicle, we're expecting 90% of touchscreens, or 90% of vehicles to have touchscreens by 2022, 80% of which will have capacitive technology. And in fact, that 80% we feel could be a bit of a conservative estimate based on the scale that you get when you're deploying that much technology across the marketplace. Now, speech recognition, another key user interface component. We're not going to talk about it much today, but from a perspective of importance in the car, I feel personally it's very, very important for any complex inputs, whether it's navigation, phone, radio, that sort of thing. Speech recognition sales are going to double between now and 2022 globally. But the more important part is that 70% of those systems in 2022 will have off-board speech recognition coming from either Apple or Google, meaning that not only will you have access to an onboard system providing that ability to do speech commands, but you'll also be accessing Siri or Google Now or Alexa or Cortana or whatever exists in that time frame for off-board, more contextual, more powerful speech recognition. And then lastly, let's talk about center and cluster displays. Just in 2016 alone, about 95 million sales combined, system sales on vehicles combined in 2016 shows that the marketplace is incredibly rich. You have customers demanding this in all segments from B and C all the way up through D and E and luxury platforms. But the designers are still really struggling with putting that large rectangle in a center cluster or in a center stack. So it's ripe for innovation for new technologies like curvature, freeform, or AMOLED display technologies to come in and start to revolutionize or evolve essentially the components in these display systems. Now, driving in a little bit deeper into center stack displays as a particular component, we're looking at our global production for center stack displays, seeing some good growth. Here we're looking at size class distribution. Very clearly put, the 7 to 8 inch size class is going to remain dominant for global production throughout the long term and throughout our forecast horizon, representing an 11% CAGR and almost 50 million units by the end of that forecast horizon. It's interesting though, while that area for center stack display is growing, essentially those other areas are essentially just flat or declining. The smaller displays, anything from 4, 5, 6 inches, will essentially start to decline because the use case is not there as much for the newer, more advanced vehicles. Every new platform from luxury to volume will be looking to make those displays in the center stack larger and more prominent going forward. Now, if we look into the display interface a little bit, looking at touch screens, from a global vehicle production standpoint, we're expecting nearly 50 million units of global production to have a capacitive touchscreen. I already mentioned this in 2022. That's a large uptick from where we are today. And interestingly, even though capacitive is certainly not a new technology to most consumer electronics markets, we have capacitive really being an important element of automotive display integration going forward because of the scale and the capabilities that it offers, where resistive technology is still alive in the marketplace, but declining slowly because it's a much less expensive, obviously, much less expensive technology to deploy in the marketplace. We do note that even in 2022, there will be some, but only 1 in 7 vehicles produced will have a center stack display without touchscreens. That's a noticeable change from where we are today. Touchscreen is a very prominent component of what we look at in terms of center stack display systems, but the bottom line is even the luxury marks like BMW, Mercedes, and Audi, who have kept off of touchscreens for many years, will be adopting them in the near-term future. Now, shifting to a different component segment, I want to talk about instrument clusters here a bit. So here's our forecast for global production by size class. And what's interesting is that a large percentage of vehicles will have an instrument cluster with a display, a TFT or greater display going forward. But what's notable here is when we look at the growth by size class, it seems almost counterintuitive that 4.x inch size class is flat. And the reason why that's counterintuitive is in other markets that size class is declining. What's interesting, though, is in the instrument cluster, there's still a lot of analog clusters out there that don't have a TFT display in it. They might have a segmented, discrete, or passive matrix OLED in it. But essentially, what we're expecting is these 4.x inch size class displays will start to evolve into those analog gauges, where the ones with the 4.x inch displays will start to evolve into larger displays. So that's why we see positive CAGRs in 7, 8 inch, 9 inch, 10 inch, 12 inch displays moving into the instrument cluster, essentially replacing maybe those smaller displays going from history. Now, looking at current clusters, from a perspective of granularity, a huge amount of focus on putting displays in the cluster for a usability perspective. The amount of redundant information that you can put through even a 4 to 5 inch display to improve the driver's line of sight and visibility makes a big difference in terms of user interface. Now, as I was talking, we were talking about analog plus analog and then analog digital gauge types. It's very clear that full digital instrument clusters will be an important part of the development of vehicle brand identification and the things that automakers are trying to do with their cockpit going forward. But even still, full digital instrument clusters, which we define as a cluster with no mechanical gauges whatsoever, will only represent 12% of the market in 2022 globally. From a production standpoint, there'll still be a heavy amount of reliance on that analog digital component because there's a bit of depth perception that is important when using a gauge in a cluster. Even the BMW 7 Series has a full digital instrument cluster. They put physical plastic bezels overlaid on top of it to give that element of depth. Now, there's some pretty impressive things that we think BMW and other manufacturers are trying to do to create more depth out of their full digital displays, maybe not using plastic bezels, but the point I'm making here is that even by the end of our forecast horizon, the volume that's lost in analog gauges will not instantly go over to full digital gauges. We'll see a bit of a transition point where analog plus digital, where there's a combined element of some mechanical stepper motor plus a maybe 5, 6, 7 inch display will be very prominent in that part of the equation. Now I want to shift to our other primary display functionality, and that's looking at head-up displays. This is a really interesting story because it's a nascent technology that's been around for a number of years, going way far back. But only in the last couple have we seen a combination of the right elements of cost, volume, and value add to the user to drive up the volume that we're seeing in today's marketplace. When we look at the chart here on the screen, we're looking at the global vehicle production with HUDs by system type. All right, and essentially we're seeing some steady growth between both windscreen and combiner HUDs. over the next 5 years. Neither system will see any real replacement, right? They're going to be growing in their separate markets because they have separate value adds based upon the type of HUD that an automaker is trying to deploy. For example, windscreen HUDs drive a lot of innovation. They've got a lot of great information you can push through, and some pretty impressive things that are being done with field of vision, and I'll talk to that in a second. But they are more expensive to manufacture, more expensive to produce into vehicles, and not as scalable. Whereas combiner HUDs, they provide a little bit less of that breadth of user experience, but at the same time offer the scalability and still a pretty good usability and functionality to the end user in the vehicle. So at that point, we see both systems, windscreen and combiner, surpassing the 5 million unit mark by the end of 2022 or shortly thereafter. But due to scalability and costs, we think that combiner HUDs will slightly eke out the windscreen HUD in terms of total vehicle production, both in CAGRs and in volumes. Talking a little bit about the display technologies within the HUDs, it's a very complex mechanism that basically takes a light source or a picture generating unit and through some degree of reflection and refraction across mirrors and windscreens will produce a virtual image. And what's really interesting here is that LCD has been the lion's share of the business in terms of PGU display type for many, many years, and that's not going away anytime soon. In fact, just over 90% of the HUDs produced in 2022 will have that same LCD framework. But what is interesting is that DMD technologies and laser scanning technologies and LCOS technologies are starting to become more production ready. And as shown in the upper right-hand part of the screen, we have these systems in production today. The Lincoln Continental HUD, which was just recently announced, has a Texas Instruments DLP chipset in it, providing a really robust field of vision and a lot of granularity in terms of the kind of GUI options that it provides Ford and Lincoln to design into their HUD. But moreover, it provides a wider field of vision the way they've designed it into the system. And it's important to note that this kind of technology is a real key part to how some premium or augmented reality HUDs might come to market. It's not to say that you couldn't provide this with maybe a larger TFT display and some complex light engineering, but bottom line is these technologies will continue to grow, and we think will, in the long run, maybe start to really contest the standard TFT technology in the future. So now I want to talk briefly about some emergent display applications, because the growth in center stack display and instrument cluster and HUD are important and viable, but it's also showing a need for displays in other applications and other parts of the vehicle that have been physically dominated by manual controls or an actual mirror. So here we're talking about rear view mirror systems. It was relatively recent that Cadillac launched this in their CT6 platform. It's also on the Chevrolet Bolt and a couple other Cadillacs. We're also seeing it with some vehicles out of Japan and that sort of thing. A lot of focus on the development of this area, and even while it's a rather new technology, we're seeing an interest in a pretty broad swath of segments and brands and vehicles, because you already have a location there for a display, and barring some human factors elements that make a display versus a mirror positive, negative, you could actually deploy this technology quicker because of the fact that you have that location and you already have wiring to that location in the center rear view mirror. So with that, we're forecasting through 2025 to reach just about 1 million units globally. This will be pretty distributed across the major markets in terms of vehicle sales and production, but ultimately we're still seeing a bit of a slow, gradual adoption for this, because as an interface, a rear view mirror has been something that anyone who's driven a car over the last 20 years or so, or even frankly beyond that, has been familiar with a mirror. And so changing that over to a display system will take time for user adoption and consumer awareness. Now, looking at a similar but very different element of mirrors, there's a prospect of removing those maybe unsightly side view mirrors that can get hit by different things and provide a lot of wind resistance, which ends up being a detriment to fuel economy with cameras. Well, when you replace those with cameras, you need to define some place to put the display output because the use case for those side view mirrors are still very, very important and highly regulated. So we're seeing a real interesting movement towards some options here. The camera system replacement is the easy part. The tough part is where to put the display, or really where to feed that camera output. And because that's a bit of an unknown in terms of the location or the type of technology or the best user experience, not to mention the regulations, we're not expecting a whole lot of quick adoption to this. That said, in some areas of the world, in Europe and in Japan, we've seen some regulatory relaxing, basically, of some of these classifications. And so that's why we're a little bit more bullish on the development of this side view display mirror system in Japan and in Europe. But bottom line is, as this kind of evolves and the best use case scenario plays out, we could see this jump up rather quickly because especially due to that compliance on vehicle emissions and fuel economy. A couple other quick pieces I just wanted to talk to you on emergent display technologies, and then I'll talk about shares. HVAC control panels, this is something that it really used to just be a button and a knob, but now going forward, the amount of capability that you can run through your climate control system with seat heaters and massage systems and different type of dual zone, quad zone climate control systems, you're going to see a need or a use case for a display to be very prominent going forward. Because of that, we know that some systems, the one pictured is from a BMW 7 Series, coming on market already today with a very advanced type of display for your HVAC control. We think that this could grow to maybe 6 million units by the end of 2025. The reason I say maybe is because there's a likelihood that the dedicated HVAC control panel could just be integrated into that center stack display that we had been talking about already. Now, a couple other areas, curved display panels. This is an area of technological development that we think designers are going to be really thirsty for, to put something other than a rigid, flat surface for display in their vehicle systems. It's probably in the 2018 timeframe that we're going to see some initial shipments start to hit the market for concepts or maybe some very niche production. But because of the cost and some of the reliability requirements that are still being figured out by the Tier 2 supply chain, there could be some modest growth. But if some of these systems take off as we expect them to, by 2025, you could be looking at 4 to 5 million units shipped into vehicles globally. And that's not exactly a huge ball to follow, a huge number of shipments to look after. But bottom line is, it's growth in an advanced type of display technology that we think will be compelling to the user experience. And then lastly, augmented reality. Augmented reality is a classification of HUD where you have a longer field of vision and a wider field of view to provide some really advanced GUI in the driver's field of vision. The thing that we think is so compelling is that it could really play into how autonomous vehicles come to be, and I'll talk to that here in a couple minutes. But in the short term, we even expect some AR light systems, some high resolution, wide field of vision, maybe far field depth perception in terms of maybe a 5 to 7 meter virtual image distance to be deployed in the next year or two on some niche vehicles. And with that, because this is going to be an incredibly expensive system to manufacture and produce, it'll be limited to the luxury markets, and even by 2025, really only be looking at about 1.5 million vehicles globally. That said, this is going to be some really fun technology to track. Augmented reality being an area that we see in many other markets in consumer electronics. In the vehicle, it's a slightly different flavor of how you would deploy it, but could be really beneficial, especially as we get into semi-self-driving cars. And then lastly, I want to talk about some of the panel technologies. It's no question that TFT LCD is the dominant player. Going through the end of our forecast horizon, it will represent 2/3 of all displays shipped to cars. This is a dominant technology. It's well established, it's easy to manufacture, it's high volume, and the popular type of segments will be shipping in incredibly high volumes, at least with respect to automotive grade volumes. That said, everyone's asking about AMOLED and what comes next. And while AMOLED's well established for consumer electronics markets, it's still a question on how you deploy it in an automotive application. And right now, the technology is not yet ready for something that would have to be safety certified or have a high degree of reliability. So while we see a couple of systems start to do small batch deployments in 2017, 2018, we're not expecting some even real significant volumes until after 2020, because that's when you can deploy the flexible AMOLEDs that have the better capacity and the better materials for deployment in the car. Now I'm going to talk about automotive display market shares and revenues. What is really interesting to me is not only the volume growth that we've just talked about, but how much money is in this segment for the Tier 1 suppliers, the Tier 2 suppliers, and others that are involved in the area. We're forecasting that it's roughly going to double in terms of Tier 1 revenue for the cluster HUDs and CSD combined, reaching about $20.8 billion by 2022. That's a huge amount of money for the supply chain to gobble up over something as simple as a display system, right? And that's not even including these other components that we're not talking to today. Just the displays alone have so much value associated with them, not just from the pure cost, but the importance to the user experience and to the value add to what they're getting out of that experience in the car. Looking at this broken out by individual system types today, roughly $5 billion for instrument clusters, $6 billion for center stack displays, and getting close to $1 billion for head-up displays today. This is based on the system revenue, not the underlying panel revenue, but suffice it to say the underlying panel revenue would be a part of that. If we look a little bit closer here, this growth on total, the $20.8 billion that I was talking to, these revenue, the revenue growth is strong in each category, and each one of them is seeing double-digit CAGRs. HUD, like I said before, is a bit of a nascent technology in some ways, and is starting to really see some impressive sales growth, seeing roughly $2.3 billion on its own in 2022, representing a 34% CAGR. Frankly, if I had the ability to manufacture a head-up display for the automotive market, that's a business I want to be in, because you're going to be printing money. Instrument clusters and center stack displays are a little bit more democratized and easier to adapt to if you've been supplying these display technologies into the market. Those will see around $8.4 billion for instrument clusters with about a 10% CAGR, and center stack display will see about a 15% CAGR, upwards of $10.1 billion in 2022. Strong growth, and actually as you see that, the fact that clusters and center stacks start to get very close in terms of the amount of revenue they can pull in is representative of how important those two systems will be. HUD will be that primary display for the driver alone that I think will still have some really significant attach rate. Now, what are the reasons that these displays are so important in the car? And there's a couple of fundamental drivers that I wanted to talk to. Volume growth is very clear, right? The demand for panels, whether it's in a cluster or a center stack, is there, and it's coming from consumer demand. And we actually have research in that space, so by all means, if you've got questions, let me know. But this customer demand is driving the volume. What ends up happening with that volume is you see scalability, and that's exactly what the capacity of the LGDs and JDIs and those Tier 2 suppliers wanted to see happen, because it was hard to justify getting into the automotive business without the scale that you see maybe in mobile phones or tablets. Now that some of those cost efficiencies are starting to realize themselves, these companies in the Tier 2 space, the panel suppliers, can justify it and are starting to really increase their production globally. It's becoming a major growth arm for those areas. And with this, higher volumes and better cost structures, you're seeing technological improvements as well. A lot of money goes into building the systems that are going to be the cash cow products for the Tier 1 display manufacturers or the Tier 2 display panel manufacturers. But the technological development is what's going to sell it and what's going to help to drive this market forward. And we really think that those two former elements are going to really drive the latter. Getting into some of the market share revenues, I'll talk quickly on some of these areas. I'm not going to go through each one of the suppliers in detail, but they're similar to what most of the infotainment system offers today. Panasonic, Visteon, Continental, those names you'll see a couple more times in these supplier share breakouts. It's interesting though, some non-head unit suppliers are going to start to grow in here because the display is modular. Right now, there's 6 suppliers control the global marketplace for about 50% of the global marketplace for center stack display. A few of them are starting to specialize a bit more. Now, if we go into 2022, note that some areas we think there'll be a bit of a decline, right? Fujitsu 10, for example, drops a little bit of their revenue in terms of their long-term perspective in this space. LG Electronics will start to gain share over the time horizon because we know that some acquisitions might be underway. Certainly there's going to be some consolidation around product lines based on the individual supplier's perspective. Some might move into compute platforms and move away from displays, etc. Bottom line is there's going to be some shifts in the share around center stack display. Essentially the same is also true for the Tier 1 revenues for instrument cluster display systems as well. Here though, Continental, Visteon, Denso, and Nippon Seiki make up a huge majority, and that's primarily because of their safety certified experience and their work with clusters for many, many years. It's a relatively non-fragmented market today, but as more and more display system suppliers pick up their safety certifications for ASIL D capability in building instrument clusters for cars, the pressure amongst Continental and Visteon will grow, and you can see some of that shift. Now, Conti and Visteon, we're pretty confident they're going to maintain their shares in the space, but a company like Denso is going to drop a fair amount. Bosch, actually, because they've been in the cluster space for quite some time, but they're really strong in some of the advanced display systems, and I think some of that will help to drive some of their growth in terms of market share. Expect to see some of the ones that are strong in center stack display start to develop products for integrated cockpits, which will start to include HUDs and clusters. Head-up displays, for example, again, a little less fragmented than center stack, a lot less fragmented than center stack. There's a complex manufacturability of these systems, and because of that, Nippon Seiki and Continental have basically 60% of the market. That's a little bit more than that. But we believe that there will be such a significant amount, I'm looking at the 2022 numbers now, such a significant amount of growth that the incumbent capacity that these suppliers have today won't be enough to feed the demand from the automakers going forward. So Nippon Seiki, for example, we're forecasting them to drop a lot of share over the forecast horizon, and companies like Panasonic and Bosch and Denso and others to pick up or maintain their share. Note, though, we also have about 15% unknown because we know that there will be 2, 3, 4 maybe new suppliers in this space that haven't yet started selling their components to the marketplace, disrupting the market. The good news is that more competition kind of floats all boats. Even though Nippon Seiki is dropping market share, we're actually going to see them still growing in terms of volume and revenue. Now, on the Tier 2 side, there's a really interesting piece underway here because we have a dichotomy of different types of display manufacturers, display panel manufacturers. And essentially, Japan Display and Sharp, they're the leaders, and they've been the leaders for quite some time. They have high production volume, and they've been there for quite some time. The others, like Kyocera, Giant Plus, even Panasonic, have been around for a while, but they've never done a whole lot of increases to production manufacturing for the purposes that they've picked out particular segments that are very important to them or that their displays can serve. Kyocera, for example, is very strong in instrument clusters. Whereas, areas like challengers from AUI, LGD, Tianma, and Innolux, they're relatively late to the game, at least respect to Japan Display and Sharp, but are going to be really pushing to capture as much volume as possible. And that's something that we're seeing really key as these challenger manufacturers come to market. The capacity is ready, their products are ready, and now they're working to sign big contracts with either Tier 1 suppliers or with OEMs directly. So now I'm going to talk briefly about how this all changes in the world of autonomous cars, because I've talked about the growth of displays today, right, and in these different segments and new applications even, driving out some real interesting capabilities for new display systems. Also, at the same time, these supplier shares and revenues are shifting rather drastically, but it's something that will change in the long run. Because think about it. The vehicle of tomorrow, today, you kind of control, you operate it, but the vehicle of tomorrow that's semi or fully autonomous, it's going to operate very, very differently. And because of that, by definition, if we look at the autonomous driving level definitions, they will have either limited driver controls or no driver controls at all. So that will then require a massive change to the interior systems. We think because of this that as you map our forecasts of autonomous driving technologies and user experience technologies, including displays, there will be a very symbiotic relationship between the growth in autonomous driving technologies and the underlying user interface technologies that will be in demand to power them. Because if you automate a vehicle today, it will feel foreign. If you automate a vehicle tomorrow, that has a totally different cockpit interface that's designed to have that transition point, that's going to be very natural to the user. One example we see here is Volvo, right? Today's vehicle, very well advanced system. They've got a great new display systems in their cluster and HUD and center stack, but it's still a vehicle designed to be controlled. It's not very contextually relevant, and the bottom line is distractions are still a negative thing. In the future, they've conceptualized how a system, an interior would look if it's designed for control or experience. A highly contextually relevant piece is critical to this because if it's not contextually relevant, you're going to run into troubles, literally. And frankly speaking, as you can see in these pictures, distraction is encouraged. Designing a system for that is going to be incredibly complex, and there's many other examples seen here that we've seen at various auto shows going forward. Looking at Lucid and BMW and Honda, Genesis, Chrysler, and Toyota, all bringing together large displays, pillar-to-pillar functionality, a focus on bringing information into the driver, into the cockpit for the perspective of understanding exactly what's going on in its environment, and some really cool holography and exciting new interfaces. The problem is, what's the common theme, right? Because they're all concepts right now, and it's our job as analysts at IHS Markit to help our customers weed through the details and understand what's actually coming out of it. Well, displays is a very critical and central component of it. It's not, by all means, the only piece, but as a function of inputs and understanding of an autonomous car around you, the importance of having a large, easy to read, high resolution display of some importance in your field of vision will be a critical factor here. The key here, though, is to blend the technologies we've talked about today with tomorrow's innovation in terms of display or interface technologies to craft that holistic user experience. Because right now, adding something like gesture recognition into a car after a car's already been designed will feel incongruent to the end user. It'll feel disjointed and it won't really make sense. But if these systems are all combined, if these individual technologies are combined together and designed from the get-go as a piece of the whole, it will be a lot more easier to understand, a lot more easier to use going forward. And that's what is so important around the automotive user experience in the autonomous car. From a conclusion standpoint, automotive displays, it's a very, very strong market. And in terms of scale, we're still looking at fractions to what the consumer electronics markets still have. But that said, as a growth engine where those have become stagnant, automotive is still very actively growing. Primary system displays like clusters, HUDs, and center stacks have strong production growth as well as technological deployment, and new applications are starting to pile on top of that with mirrors and HVAC and other systems. The revenues are strong, $28.8 billion. It's a huge market to be a part of. And again, as a growth engine, both the tier 1 suppliers and the tier 2 suppliers are avidly interested in what's happening here. And the automakers are going to see cost savings, even though this revenue share will start to increase. That said, the suppliers in the space that are strong today will probably be able to be strong in the future, but they're continually going to be challenged by new startups and new display technologies or niche products that are offering something different to the market. And they'll have to continue to stay strong in their respective markets to ensure that they don't exactly lose too much of the pie to these new market entrants. And then lastly, if we look much further into the future, tomorrow's vehicles, I mean, they're designed to be experienced, right? A vehicle that drives itself is going to have to understand me, and I'm going to have to understand it. And because of that, the cockpit has to change fundamentally. We talked about how L4 and L5 autonomous vehicles, they're going to surpass a certain amount of volume by 2035. And that's great and all, but understanding when the technologies for the interior cockpit come to play is very, very important, and what technologies are going to be the most important. User interaction design is going to change fundamentally, and OEMs are putting all sorts of great new ideas into the concepts that they have today, which will underpin the cars of the next 5 years. Among other technologies, things like large, high-resolution and advanced displays will take a central role in this area of defining the new cockpit designs and helping to define what the autonomous car is. So I think that's all I've got for you. It's time for questions. Ruby, back to you.